kind of travel everywhere, and this is part of the reason why I wanted to bring up this topic. You know, it's one of those things, this specific topic, the Spanish language. A lot of people tend to have this fear almost of speaking Spanish and what that might look like. So I wanted to just rip the Band-Aid with you guys and just involve you in what that might look like in your communities and how I can maybe help you with some of the things I've learned, not only as someone of the Latine community, but who has had to go out into the communities and try to bridge these gaps or maybe even just start those relationships. And maybe, hopefully, you guys can get some tips out of this as well. So just quick raise of hands. How many of you are in a community that you know there is a Latine presence? So all of you, good job. I think you're in the right place. And how many of you actually know Spanish? Okay, so a good handful. But even those of us who do know Spanish, I feel like we have come into a barrier because we are animal welfare, la perrera, if you will, you know, the dog catchers. So it's not always a positive light that we're being seen in, regardless of what your status is in animal welfare. So I think that'll also help with some of these barriers, or at least that's my hope for you guys. There will be a section, hopefully, for questions at the end if you guys have. But I thank you for that information. And like any good, loving Hispanic woman that I am. I was raised right by my abuelos. I brought you guys some candy, so there's different kinds. Feel free to come around. There's, for those of us who are in the community, you'll know what these are. There's dovalines, there's tamarindos. For those of you who don't know, ask a neighbor who may know what these are. So here you go. There's also, just know there are candies in there that are peanut allergy. For our peanut allergy friends, do not touch the yellow box of de la rosas. They're called mazapans. Those are made of peanuts only, so do not touch those. I have warned you. So anyway, this is just kind of one simple way to really just connect with your Latine community. We love food. I could say that, right? And I think that's something common for everyone in the room. And one of the other things that you'll hear me say often is that regardless of what language you speak, we all have one thing in common, and that's our passion for animals. So use that to your advantage, right? So anyway, again, hello, howdy, hola, buenos dias. My name is Jackie, one more time. And I was born and raised in South Texas, Laredo to be exact. So not quite, you know, Rio Grande, well, we are Rio Grande Valley, depending on who you ask, right? We're still part of the 956. But, you know, historically speaking, we've been like that side of the 956. So I get it. We'll talk about that later, though. And because I grew up in the valley, if you will, I learned both ends of the spectrum. So my full name, my legal name, don't tell anyone, my government name is actually Jacqueline Hernandez. And fun story, the reason why my parents decided to name me Jacqueline was because they thought that in the future, having a more Hispanic type name would actually be something that would be, what do you call it? A hindrance, thank you very much, for me versus something that would be to my advantage. And I've actually found it to be quite the opposite growing up. But I knew then that, I thought then that wasn't necessarily going to be the case. But growing up now, I know that that's not the case. And I'm actually very proud of it. So, and I know some of you are too. So step one, regardless of whom you are, what your community looks like, is getting to know what that community actually is. You'll see here I took this quote from, I believe this was Forbes, but basically what they were saying is that they did a study in 2017, and the Latinos that owned pets skyrocketed from 11.4 to 20.4 million people. That's a lot of people, that's a lot of pets. And so there's different reasons as to why they thought that was, but one of them was the marketing for the Latine community was an untapped water, if you will. And we started to realize that this was more towards the marketing industry, right? So like pet products and things like that. But imagine if we, as an adoption agency, started to reach out to these people, like, wow, that's a lot of humans that we maybe have not considered even talking to before. One thing I do want to preface is that the term Latine is actually what I would consider an umbrella term. And that's also something super important to keep in mind moving forward, because while I am very proud to be Latine, I also consider myself Hispanic, but maybe my neighbor who's from Cuba is not, or my Dominican Republic friend isn't. So just because I'm Latine does not mean that a specific person is a Hispanic and or any other type of ethnicity. So keep that in mind. Latine is not one group of people, it's a collective. And that's super important too, because some people will get offended. And, we had a talk not that long ago about what even that was, right? Because we were often referred to like Latinx. That was a huge thing before. And we've decided we're actually moving away from that. We're now starting to go with Latine. It's more friendly, more inviting. It's more inclusive, if you will. So just keep that in mind too. I know a lot of people, when I first proposed this, was saying Latinx. And I was like, wait, just kidding. It's Latine. And then, of course, not only in your communities, but who within your team. So that your team could be a volunteer and or a staff member. There's a lot of, again, untapped waters, even within organizations. People don't know the special skill because, again, maybe the way we grew up in the past, it wasn't something we were proud of or that we acknowledged that we spoke English or Spanish, or vice versa, right, in some communities. So make sure that you know who within your organization is going to be your ally when it comes to bridging these gaps. And again, once you know what communities you're trying to reach out to and branch out to, that's going to make a big difference because as we all know, or most of us know, while I am Hispanic, I celebrate certain things in my culture that might not be the same thing for someone who maybe is from the Dominican Republic or Venezuela or wherever they might be from. So my culture is different than my fellow, but we still have that one thing in common. So keep that in mind. Your community is going to look different depending on who is within your community. And know that you have multiple communities within the one that you serve. So breaking down the language barrier, that's kind of obvious, right? So one of the things that I've noticed, the more I get into animal welfare and moving out to different areas, is that there actually are very little to no resources in Spanish. We might be seeing those now in the RGV in Rio Grande Valley, but it's just now starting. So what took us so long? And I think part of it was the assumption, right? We assumed that someone somewhere would get it translated. If they really cared enough about their pet, then they would make the effort to do it. But really, it should be us making the efforts to reach out to them. So keep that in mind when you're going back to your leadership and explaining to them the why it's important for us to be translating these things for them or giving them these resources. It's because it is our duty to make sure that we are able to reach as many humans as possible to better the lives of the animals that we're serving. So these are two examples that you could also take back to your leadership. One is from Best Friends Animal Society. We started a whole marketing campaign against being, Spanish speaking, inclusive, making sure that all the information that we had in English was also going to be in Spanish, and letting everyone know that this is the website that you can come to find it. And there was even a section where you could submit information or a request for information if we didn't already have it. So that was also really nice of us. I know that's a biased statement, but I've used this more often than not, to other people within my community, my grandma, like explaining something. I'm like, go here. If I don't know the answer, you'll find it here. And if you don't, there's a section for you for that. So we've learned what other people within our community want to learn as well. And then Arizona Humane, they're another great website that I like to steal ideas from because they have a section, when you enter their website, they actually have like a little buddy that pops up and says, Habla Español. And I'm like, oh, how convenient. That's what I'm looking for. And so it direct links me to a new area and everything, again, that they have in English, they have in Spanish. So they talk about, low cost veterinary services, what I do if I lost a pet, things of that nature. And this will help regardless of what people within your communities you're trying to branch out to, because they can then make the efforts to, do some more research or see if there's even anyone within their area. And even if you don't have the ability to translate a whole website or a whole page on your website, at least giving them the resource that they need to then get that information. There are quite a lot of volunteers within your community, I can guarantee you, that are willing to be your hotline, if you will, if that were to happen. So maybe just thinking of something as simple as like creating an email that could then go to that person so that they can get that translated. That could be a volunteer position. I know that I started doing that at one of my shelters, and it was a one-person show, but she was phenomenal about it, and everyone knew her as like Titi, right? So like that was their tia. Everyone knew her, and she was Titi, and it was great. Another thing I wanted to preface as well is when we're working on translating our things, to make sure that we don't overcomplicate things. And I'll share a story with you. That's kind of my bullet point number 3, is making sure your content is going to your younger communities. I can't tell you how many times, while my parents were fluent in English, for my grandparents, I'd have to go somewhere with them and be their translator at 8 or 9. My favorite story to tell for that example is I went with my grandfather once to the bank. and he needed to do something for something, I don't know, because I was 8. And the guy was like, I need this tax form, and, he could go to jail if they're not filled out right, da-da-da-da. Tell him. And I'm like, okay. So the guy said, if you don't fill this out, you're going to go to jail. And my grandfather was like, what? I just want to, get a loan, But there was a miscommunication because I, the 8-year-old, know nothing about taxes. And I now have to explain to my grandfather that if he doesn't submit this form, it could lead to legal issues. But all I heard was jail, taxes bad, right? So I went back and I said, jail, taxes bad. So just make sure that the information that you are giving out to your communities is easy enough for anybody to understand. And empower the staff that you do have, again, whether that is actual staff or volunteers, to be able to go out and just empower the rest of their community. I can't tell you how many times someone's walked in the door and hoped that I spoke Spanish. I'm like, oh, hablas español, they'll whisper it. And it's just because it's something that historically had been a shameful thing. And once I'm like, yeah, I do actually, they're like, oh, thank God. But it probably took a lot of people to get to that feeling. So just trust with your staff that they will be able to do the right thing and communicate with the right people when needed. My favorite. So for those of us that know Spanish, know that the word popote for us in Mexico is straw, but it could also be all these other things for all these other communities. So just keep in mind when someone is asking you, how do you say this? ¿Cómo se dice esto? You have to consider the community, the audience in which you're trying to target, right? Popote is one of many examples of how one word can mean many things for many different people. And this is like an ongoing debate for anyone in the Latine community, what straw really is. Those of you shaking your heads, the struggle is real. Because I can go into a Cuban restaurant and be like, hey, can I have a popote? And they're like, a what? But for those of you who haven't experienced that, that's just one example of many different ways that one word could get you in a lot of trouble. So while technology is amazing and it can do beautiful things, keep that in mind. It's still a robot, or not AI, depending on which program software you're using. So it doesn't feel emotion, it does not understand the content, and it does not understand the audience. So again, making sure that your content is being expressed, that the local slang, sometimes, I have cousins that live in different parts of Mexico, and when we all get together, I'll use one word again, and he's like, wait, what did you just say? And I'll explain it a little bit better, and he's like, that's definitely what that does not mean that in Guadalajara or the DF or wherever they're from, right? So just making sure that the local slang is appropriate to the conversations you're having as well. And we'll go over a little bit of that as well later, but the tone and the style is also important. I can't tell you how many times people walk up and they're like, "Ay," I'm like, "I good, I bad," give me more context, right? So the tone is very important when translating as well. And again, the complexity. So if you can't explain it to a 9-year-old who is afraid of taxes now, maybe you should loosen your language a little bit, make it a little bit friendlier. As an organization, you have the power to come up with whatever terms work best for your community. And Best Friends has decided that with our group. So we actually have a glossary, and you guys are welcome to have it. But one of the things that we found was really impactful was, again, the informal tone that we use. So when I talk to my abuela, I say usted, because that's the proper thing to do, and she'll hit me with a chancla if I don't. But if I'm talking to my friend, my sister, my coworker, it's tú, right? Like, tú, yeah, you. So it's different, but we want that to be that inviting friend, that inviting party. So as an organization, we decided to use tú when we are using our social media. So, things like tu mascota, or, whomever that might be. So just keep that in mind. That's what we decided as an organization. You have the power to decide whatever you guys want. But that's also one simple way that you can do a lot with one word, or a tone, if you will. Another good example is outdoor cats. So the negative had been, what we historically have used in Mexico at least, was, callejeros, right? Stray animals. That's what most people would use as a slang. But it was showing that negative connotation. So callejero, for those who don't know, is kind of like a loose slang for like a street person or street animal. They're just callejeros. But what we're saying now is they're actually an outdoor and or community cat, so they're gatos comunitarios, they're community cats. So again, just making sure that the terms that you're using are expressing the actual content that you want. So where callejero has that negative stray, non-ownership, a community cat or a gato comunitario is a community cat. So we own it as a community, and that makes a big difference in the message that you're trying to, relay. And my favorite thing to talk about is, are you fluent in compassion, right? So when speaking to anybody in any context about anything, we should, as humans, try to be nice humans. And being fluent in compassion does mean just being able to bring you whatever is going on in the world, the real raw emotions of animal sheltering it happens all day, every day. So making sure that step one is going to be that we really just human to human try to understand whatever that effort might look like. And everyone's efforts are going to be different depending on your skill set. But my suggestion to any organization trying to be more exclusive is learn key phrases that will help de-escalate a situation, whether that's from nervousness, I just lost my pet, I don't know what to do. The fear of, I would fear losing my pet and then having to go in to try to reclaim my animal, because that's a big thing, right? There's fees, and what if I'm in trouble, and maybe my dog wasn't vaccinated on time. So in addition to not speaking the same language as you, now I have all these other fears. So just making sure that you as an organization know what these key phrases are, because again, words like just saying like hola is a really great thing to know. And it just brings down that barrier that maybe a person might assume that we have. We want to be as welcoming as possible. My favorite thing to teach anybody who does not know Spanish is un momento, which literally means one moment. And that could be one moment, I have no idea what's going on, let me go get someone. But you're telling that person that I know enough to know that you are in distress and or you need help, and I'm going to go find that person for you. So un momento can also be a really nice way to segue towards, I don't know what's going on, but let me go get someone for you. Lo siento. So many people don't say lo siento anymore. I'm like, excuse me, that was rude. So lo siento, I'm sorry. That 2 words, very simple to say, and easy to remember, hopefully, to where if someone does come in, you can say lo siento, no sé, or no, lo siento poquito. A little bit does really go a long way. And I'm going to say that a lot in this talk, so I apologize in advance. But I just want you guys to know that these little few phrases can really make the world of a difference when you're talking to a human, because you're making the effort. You're making the effort to remind them that it is okay, whatever's going on, we're going to fix it together. And if they've made the effort to come to your shelter not knowing your language, that's a big thing, right? They have put forth that effort to try to communicate with you because they do care. That's another thing that I find interesting. When I started moving from state to state and kind of deterred myself from Texas, I was like, oh, I'll never need Spanish again. And, I kind of got rusty with it. But, even in the most recent place I was at was Alabama, and I was like, I'm definitely never going to need this here. But that was actually very much not the case. And I used it all the time at the grocery store, at the shelter, wherever I might have been. People were coming to me, assuming, of course, that I knew Spanish, or at least hoping, that's probably a better word to use, hoping that I spoke Spanish because they just needed directions or they really just didn't know. And that's a vulnerable thing to do, because put yourself in, for those of us that do vacation, that's crazy, right? I'm super lost. I have no idea where I am. I'm in a whole different country with different time zone, like, oh my gosh. And so a lot of these families are doing the same thing. So just keep that in mind too, that while we do have that language barrier, this person has made the effort to come to communicate with me, or, just simply reach out. And vice versa, if you're going out to somebody's community, you want to be invited, you want that café, you want that, pan dulce, whatever they're offering you, take it. Well, most of the things anyway. We'll talk about that later. But you want to make sure that they are comfortable enough to invite you to their home. So part of this talk, unfortunately, was going to be about grassroots as well, but I've kind of shifted it since, but I do want to kind of put that plug in as well. So when you are making these efforts to reach out to these communities, also having some of these key phrases, because as you start to learn about this person, they're going to tell you about their life. It's just something that's natural to us. We want to tell you all the things about my neighbor and about my cousin and about her dog and things of that nature. So also just key phrases that are going to help you understand what might be going on with the situation, whether it be good, whether it be bad. the overall, you want to at least have the very basics so that you could start the conversation. You might not be the one to fulfill whatever the goal is at that day, but you can at least be that person that invited them to be part of that conversation. My other favorite thing to do, again, is ask my volunteers within the community to do on-call emergencies. So that's when you don't have someone on your staff that maybe an emergency were to come in, you can call that volunteer up and say, hey, I don't really know what's going on. This lady's speaking to me in Spanish. Can you maybe help me translate? And I used to do that all the time at embeds, or even in cities that I'm no longer embedded with. They'll call me up and be like, hey, this lady's asking me something. Usually it's a lady, but sometimes it's a guy, right? And I have no idea what's going on. She's like she's in distress. Can you just help us out? So they'll pass the phone to me and I'll explain. Sometimes it's something as simple as like, hey, they've lost their pet and they just want to fill out a lost and found form. Or it could be something a little bit more intense, like maybe there's a medical emergency. But having that on-call person will really be valuable to you in that real-time true emergency where you don't have time to translate or even figure out how to do that. Other ways that you can be at the ready, besides having the resources, is just having, like, again, that app. You have to be careful with some of these apps because they're literal translators. But, that's something where here in Omaha, they're actually doing where a lot of the staff are actually contracted, so they don't necessarily speak English or are not comfortable speaking English. So one of the managers will actually communicate via the app. And that's been really helpful. I do put that in the resources for you guys. But that's something that you want to also keep in mind is like the world is your oyster, right? It's 2023. There are many different ways to figure out how to communicate with a human. The do's and the don'ts. So for me, some of these were pretty obvious, but I like to go over them anyway. So I do want you to remember that a little bit does go a long way. Spanglish is okay. If I'm talking to my grandma, maybe not so much because she's a grammar, she loves to be correct about her grammar, but she's not someone that I would naturally speak to in a slang time form. And she knows Spanish and I know that. But if it's somewhere where you just need to make that connection, that bridge, that gap, whatever the case might be, again, saying things like, un momento, no sé, I'm gonna go get help. Like they'll get that enough, right? So it's okay. I know it naturally in high school Spanish, they're like, no, you need to say the whole thing. But more often than not, if someone knows that you've made an effort, that you care enough to tell them that you're going to go seek help for them, they really appreciate that. Use visuals. So I actually I'm sure that the veterinarian I worked for at the time, he did low-cost spay neuters in South San Antonio, Texas, predominantly Spanish speakers, lower income. And so we knew going forth into this community that we would have Spanish speakers. He thought, okay, a couple dogs, cats, one fluent employee, myself and another coworker who kind of got by, she grew up in the area. That would be enough. But come to find out, because that resource was in high demand, we were seeing over 150 animals in like 2-hour gaps. So 2 people to translate for 150 people was just not possible. So moving forward, what he decided was actually using visuals. And this is actually really convenient for both the adoption and the veterinary world. But what he did was he made his questionnaires in English and in Spanish so he could understand what questions the people were answering, right? Something as simple as like, what's your name? Name, English and Spanish, name, nombre. And so you knew what the answer was. But also on the back, he was able to ask the owners without a translator what was going on with the pet. So, ¿dónde duele? Where does it hurt? And people could circle, kind of like in the doctor's office where they'll have you circle like where it hurts, same concept. And that really helped him at least start to understand and get a treatment plan if it was a true emergency and someone needed to step aside and really assess that issue until a translator could come in. And another thing that worked was when it came to translating for the treatment plan, he just had a template, right? So the pills were, 2 pills twice a day for how many days. He would just fill it in, and it would have an explanation for the person if it was something like heartworm prevention and or treatment starting. So doxy for 30 days. That's kind of a norm. We knew that would happen, so we started doing that for things of that nature as well. And it really helped him reduced the need for translators in real time because he was able to at least communicate with them through this piece of paper that helped give him the information in English, but the person the information in Spanish. So think of things like that as well. It's okay to use visuals. I know some people will like draw out sometimes whether they want a dog or a cat or what the case might be, but that's okay to do too. Just figure it out, be creative. Human translators are going to be your best bet if you are not fluent yourself. But I know that that's not always the case. So again, using like an app to fill for a human translator is also acceptable because again, you're making that effort. Have all your materials available in English and Spanish. If you're not already doing this, if there's one thing I need you to do walking out this door is text your leadership and be like, we need all of our stuff in English and in Spanish. Reach out to your volunteers and see if there is truly someone in your area that can translate. For some people, that's pie. They do it in their sleep. I dream in Spanish, so like I could probably do it in my sleep, you know? So just know that there is a possibility that there is someone out there in your community that will be willing to do that for you, and it's effortless. You send them the documentations, they send it back, boom, done. But make sure that you explain the content, right? Because some of the stuff is really scary in English when you're translating in Spanish, and maybe you want to be more friendly or loose about the language that you're using. And maybe that person in the community, your volunteer, already knows the community in which you're working with and the language, the slang that you're wanting to engage to be part of that communication, that conversation. That's also super important. Don't. So I don't want you to assume that they don't understand or speak English. More often than not, the assumption is, oh, they don't know, so I'm just going to not even try. But what the opposite should be happening. Assume that they do know English, but maybe that's not their preferred language. Just because they know English does not necessarily mean that they want to speak it. And that goes both ways. Just because you know Spanish doesn't mean you're comfortable with it. But maybe you guys can meet halfway. So I'll speak to you a little bit in Spanish, you speak to me a little bit in English, and we'll get through this together. Don't rush the conversation. So many times, especially in the veterinary field aspect of animal sheltering, we get into that rush. We need to get stuff done. And even in animal welfare, there's 10 people in line. I need to get this adoption done. Like, oh, let's just get out of here. But if you're rushing the conversation, you're missing the important keys that might get that dog to stay in homes forever. So like maybe there was important information like you're adopting a puppy. So make sure we stay active and we do this or that. If you're not having those conversations already, you need to make sure that they're coming through. And it just make sure that you set aside the time to try to make the efforts to make sure that your language you are communicating in that language well enough. Be culturally insensitive. So again, just because I am a person that considers myself Latine, I do not consider myself, Venezuelan. I am Hispanic or I am Mexican, but those things mean different things to different people. So just make sure that you are being insensitive about the languages in which we're using. And that goes to, especially when going out into the communities, you want to make sure that the targeted audience are going to accept that slang or that word or whatever you might be using appropriately. So you want to do some research before, and that involves going out to the community and figuring what that is out. And then don't make it difficult for someone to receive that information. So remember 8-year-old me trying to figure out taxes, super scary. I don't want to ever do that again. Even now, I would never want to explain to someone how to file taxes correctly or they could go to jail. Like that's still a scary sentence to me to say. I'm triggered by it. So again, make sure the information, anyone at any point can understand it because you've made it that simple. And it doesn't have to be complicated, right? So we can explain anything as simply as we can. If you can't explain it to a child, like maybe that's another conversation that we should have because they are part of the family. They are part of this, growing up with this animal. And bilingualism saves lives. It can and it does. This is Diego. So I love this story. This actually happened in Prattville where I was embedded. So Diego's person came to the shelter. I was doing playgroup actually. And so a kennel staff member, the front staff member came up to me and said, hey, there's this lady, she's like crying, there's a dog in a box. I was like, what? I was like, okay, what does that have to do with me? And they're like, well, we think she speaks Spanish. We're not sure. We were like, all right. So I went up there and I was like, ¿Cómo le puedo ayudar? How can I help you? And she starts crying even more. I was like, I literally just asked her, how can I help you? What's going on? So she explains to me that she has a dog. He had been missing for 3 to 4 days. She had posted on Nextdoor, all the lost and found groups. She had emailed our shelter and a couple other surrounding shelters in the area, and no one got back to her. She couldn't find her pet. But she finally did find her pet, and he had, unfortunately, she thinks, gotten hit by a car. So she tried to go to 2 different vet clinics, and they couldn't help her because she didn't speak English. She tried 2 different shelters. They turned her away because she couldn't speak English. So she finally came here, and I was able to help her. So I learned about Diego and who he was, and that she couldn't afford his care. But she really did love him, and she didn't want to be this bad guy because of it. She just couldn't get the help she needed because she can't speak the language. And even if she could, she doesn't know if she has the money, blase, blase, right? We've all kind of heard that story. So once I got to know her, I got to know Diego, and I got some history. I asked her, like, why did you come here? Like, let's get some information. She's like, well, I came here because no one else would talk to me. So, I was like, all right, well, we're going to do the intake. So I got her ID, and I learned that she was actually from a city nowhere near our jurisdiction, and technically I couldn't take the dog. So I had to go back there and say, hey, like, I don't know that I could take this dog because you're not part of our jurisdiction. She explained to me that she has spent all the previous day and all of today, it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, trying to find someone to help her, and I was the only person that spoke Spanish, or even made an effort to, my staff. So we made the exception, and we took Diego in, and he was able to receive the veterinary care that he needed. But that really resonated with me, because I was like, this woman spent a day and a half looking for somebody, anybody on social media, in her communities, trying to find someone to help her with her dog, because she knew she cared enough to know that she could not care for him enough. She wanted to do something to save him. And so that just really goes a long way. Like, the effort is there with a lot of these communities. We just have to be able to match that energy for them and understand that it's okay. Like, Spanglish is okay. We'll get through this together. A little bit goes a long way. So I'm happy to report that Diego is doing well. He has since been adopted and living a grand old life with a great rescue. You'll see his before and after. So he got a wheelchair. He went through like this crazy therapy with the shelter or the rescue that he's with now. He's running around now. But none of this would have been possible if she hadn't made the continuous efforts that she did make to try to save her dog's life. But also, there was someone able to have that conversation with her, because all these other shelters just assumed she was trying to dump this dog. Oh, there we go. So, síguenos en nuestras redes sociales. So that literally translates to follow us on social media. And so one of the things that's super important about social media is how powerful it is. And it could be both your friend or your foe, right? We know that collectively. But one of the things that I don't see a lot of these communities doing is using whatever culture within your communities to branch out to these untapped waters. So the far left picture is actually a picture from when I worked in Brownsville, Texas. They have something called Charro Days. So if you're not from the RGV, you're not really going to get it. But basically, it's like a week-long celebration of our culture, our history. People from it's a border town, so they're bordered to Mexico. The cities across come together. They bring down the bridges. It doesn't matter where you're from. You're all one big happy family. And we weren't promoting our dogs or cats through this Charro Day. I'm like, man, what a like, they want to celebrate too, right? So we did a cute thing where we put them in charro costumes, and we had like big fiesta, and like it worked. It was great. People were like, oh yeah, I do want a dog, or I do want a cat. And I was like, man, yeah, they want a party too. One of the other things that was happening at this one specific shelter was they were a border town, and they weren't adopting out to citizens in Mexico. And I'm like, guys, they live, like, I could throw a rock. Like, it should be okay. Like, I can go find them if I need to. But that's another question to ask your organization. Are we putting the barrier simply because they're in another country, and what does that look like? Because they come to school here, they use our grocery stores. Some of them are employees of these areas that we're in. So why can't they adopt if they can do all these other things? So keep that in mind too. Just because they live across the border does not necessarily mean that they're not. A, they would probably be phenomenal adopters, and B, if they're making the effort and they're already here, why not? So talk about that. Bring up that conversation. One thing I love are cats, and while I don't drink coffee, a lot of people within the community that I serve do like coffee. So I was like, café, gatos. That works, right? So we actually invited people to come out. This is actually in Laredo, Texas. Cafecito con gatitos. So literally it's kind of like a mini coffee shop, if you will. So you come down to the shelter, you buy coffee from a specific fundraiser, and you just drink coffee in their open cat rooms. And it was a hit. Like, they loved it. They raised a lot of money. Cats got adopted. And it was able to invite the community into the area. And we were celebrating the culture, right? So we were celebrating them within our shelter. We weren't even branching out to them. We were inviting them in to have coffee with us and our cats. So that was a simple way that we could do all of the things that we wanted to do with one simple event. If you're not already following if you're not already following people on social media that predominantly speak Spanish, I invite you to, because they have great ideas. What I like to follow, this big one is La Ciudad de Guadalajara. That's part of where some of my family is from. So that one is a simple, like, PSA, if you will, as to why it's important to have a pet. And so it's so simple, but it was so engaging as well. It got shared over 242 times with their specific people. And it's such a simple message that so many people related to, again, because they're passionate about their pets. And croqueton, so that one's like a mega adoption / dog food drive that they did. Croqueton is just, it sounds cool, right? Like, you want to be part of that. So with the croqueton, we were able, they were able, I was not involved with that, but they were able to collect dozens and dozens of pallets of food. And this was at a gym, and they just had puppies running around. Like, that was like their attention grabber, if you will. But they had dogs up for adoption, and it was a food drive. So it was really cute, really simple, but it went a long way. So just make sure that your messaging is also branching out to your communities. We did adoption events in Brownsville, so we made sure that even our adoption signs were in English and in Spanish, because that's important too. We want to celebrate the big wins with the little wins, and so adopting a new family member goes a long way too. It's a happy moment. People want to take selfies with their pets regardless of what language you speak, so just have those available for that community member as well. Make sure that you're inviting them to celebrate their culture within your own organization. And here's some examples from different areas where we started using Spanish to translate in English. So this one on the right, most of us have seen this poster around, right? So that's like doggy behavior. I see this everywhere, allwhere on Facebook, but I bet not very many people knew that it's actually been translated by her team into Spanish. So that's something that you could add to your adoption packet if you aren't already, to let people, to have that conversation with them on how to successfully keep a pet in their home. And that's a resource that Dr. Chin has on her website. So like anyone can go get that. The one in the middle, again, is the animal parts. And so we know what these parts are in English, so we can also, again, do that pointing system that I was talking about earlier. So does it hurt here? Does it hurt here? Where is the bleeding coming from? And because a citizen can read that in Spanish, you can then figure out what they're talking about in your comfortable language, whatever that might be. And there's a lot of I think this is a national movement, not just for animal welfare, but collectively. We know that there is a Latine community that has not been tapped. So there's a wonderful group, I love them so much. They're called Vetspacito. And they're a group of veterinarians who, one of them is fluent from Mexico. She's come over to the US to start practicing. And the other is a non-fluent veterinarian. He just graduated from vet school. And he realized that the community he was serving was bombarded with people who only knew Spanish. And he's like, I can't help you because I don't know anything in Spanish. So he's actually been very vulnerable and very honest about what that looks like for him as a veterinary professional. And he started Vetspacito. And so he's actually gotten a lot of really cute and creative videos going to help people have those conversations like heartworms. Heartworms is hard to explain in English. Good luck explaining in Spanish. If people don't listen, it's boring. They don't, not that they don't care, it's just complicated. And so, sometimes it's nice having those resources readily available, and they already exist. So use them to your advantage. You want to make sure that people have that at the ready, because you know how many kids come up and they're like, oh, what's this about? And, next thing you know, they're experts on heartworm, So just make sure that you have it at the ready. And a little bit goes a long way. So just, even if you have them out in the lobby or in your adoption flyers, maybe some people won't read them, but the chance that someone will and will learn something new is more likely and worth the effort. And again, a lot of these resources are already online. You just have to find them, or I'm happy to share them, because that's what I love to do. But you can find almost every topic, whether that be through a resource here in the United States or maybe in area within, whatever that community might look like. There are organizations out there in different communities already doing this, so reach out to them. You know how many people would be so excited because someone in the United States is wanting to reach out to these communities? Like, that's not something that's something we want to hear. So, anytime I go visit my cousins in Mexico, they're like, oh man, tell me all about it. Why can't best friends come here? And I'm like, well, hold on, let's have a conversation about what those organizations look like for you. And so it's a great conversation to have regardless of who you are, what you look like, what language you speak. Communication is a beautiful thing and a complicated thing, but just know that your efforts to make these conversations happen are being felt by your community members who maybe don't speak English. So just remember, use the app. These are some of the resources. I can also send them to you, but I know that some people will really want that image guide and glossary. This is a best friends one, so feel free to snap that picture. I apologize to you sending it out in advance because you're probably gonna get a lot of emails. But this is something really helpful and people just don't know it exists already. And one of the things I recently thought about was one of the shelters was actually naming their dogs to target a specific audience. So they wouldn't name their dogs Gilbert or, John. They wouldn't, not that anyone does, right? Those were terrible examples, but you know what I mean. They were naming their dogs, things like Pan Dulce or Canela, because that's what people in the community engage with. They want that dog that's named, we all have that one cousin with a dog named Blanco, or, we all know that one guy, or that one grandma. So but that is what's happening in our community. So embrace it, use it to your advantage. For our veterinary friends, the first link is Vetspacito. Why can't I say that today? Vetspacito. But also, HSUS also came out with a whole book specific to our field, right? It's a little outdated, if I'm being honest and fully transparent, but it is useful for those people who at least want to start having that conversation. And the reason I included it is because it also helps you pronounce. It has breakdowns of pronunciation. So for those of us who might not even know where to start having these conversations with people in our communities, you could at least have that conversation and it'll help you pronounce some of these more complicated words. And I'm always happy and able, willing. I would love to help more people in the community speak Spanish. So I'm always here for you if you ever needed me. And know that I love each and every one of you already, and I hope you got candy. So thank you. I do not want to take it home. Thank you. Oh, did they? Okay. Oh, who has the candy? Oh, it's over there. Okay. Please take candy. I don't want it. I can't take it back with me, so it's somewhere over there.